This is John Sadler, and welcome to our video on how to properly deduct from uninsured subs. Notice the use of the word properly. There's a lot to know about how to deduct or withhold from uninsured subs. It's critical that you properly administer this important function because just one small mistake can be very costly. Furthermore, once you've made the mistake, you may not realize it until your audit, and by that time it will probably be too late to go back to the sub and ask for more money. Of course, it's our recommendation that you don't use any uninsured subs because doing so places your own insurance loss record at risk, which can result in future rate increases or non-renewal by your carrier. It also results in administrative hassle and expense. The vast majority of subs used by our builders are insured. Most builders plan on only using insured subs. However, the reality is that most end up with at least several uninsured subs despite their best efforts. The insurance carriers that write work comp and general liability usually don't have a problem when a builder uses an uninsured sub. However, there are some exceptions. Many carriers that write work comp for builders won't insure a builder that intends on using an uninsured roofer sub due to the high-risk nature of this type of work. Also, from a general liability perspective, you'd never want to use an uninsured mechanical sub, such as one that performs electrical, plumbing, or HVAC work, as these areas are also considered to be high risk for occasional large losses. An uninsured sub can simply be defined as one that can't provide you with a valid certificate of insurance for either workers' compensation, general liability, or both for the time period that they perform work for you. We've produced an excellent video on how to properly collect certificates of insurance, and I strongly recommend that you check it out because there's a lot to know and a lot that can go wrong in this area. At the end of your policy year for both work comp and general liability, you'll be audited, and you must provide the auditor with a valid certificate of insurance for each sub that you use. If you do this, you won't be charged extra for uninsured subs. If you can't provide a valid certificate of insurance, the auditor will make a charge as if the uninsured sub were your employee. This extra charge upon audit is a cost of doing business that should be accounted for. It's standard within the industry for builders to deduct or withhold from their payments to uninsured subs to offset this extra insurance charge. As you can see from this screen, the charges for the use of an uninsured sub are significantly higher for work comp than for general liability. For this reason, some builders choose not to deduct for general liability for an uninsured sub. However, if you don't deduct for general liability, you're leaving a lot of dollars on the table and not giving your sub incentive to get his own coverage. This screen is a comparison of current rates in South Carolina from a carrier that specializes in insuring builders. The rates per $100 also translate into the percentage that you would need to deduct. For example, the work comp rate per $100 of payroll for residential carpentry is $19.51. You can also think of this as having to deduct 19.51%. And one final clarification is that when you deduct for workers' compensation, you're actually extending work comp benefits to the sub's employees. On the other hand, when you deduct for general liability, you're not extending any coverage to the sub. Instead, you're merely accounting for a cost of doing business. Upon audit, your insurance carrier is only going to apply the classification code rates to the labor costs provided by the uninsured sub. The rates are not applied to the cost of materials provided by the sub. Therefore, when deducting from the uninsured sub, you should only base your deductions on the sub's labor charge. Hopefully, the sub's invoice will break out labor versus materials, and this will simplify the process. If not, you should ask for a revised invoice that breaks out labor versus materials. If you can't get a revised invoice, your auditor has wide discretion in estimating the labor percentage. There are two rules of thumb that are commonly followed when there is no breakout on the invoice and when the sub provides all materials. The first is that it's assumed that the labor charge will be for 50% or more of the invoice total. The second is in the case when the sub uses heavy equipment, such as for land clearing or excavation. Most auditors will assume that only 33.33% of the invoice is allocated to labor. Once you've determined the labor charge for each uninsured sub, you need to properly classify the type of work that each sub performs. We discussed in an earlier video how the classification rules for builders can be complicated, especially as concerns the use of the residential carpentry classification. Let's take a minute to review the use of the residential carpentry code. Residential carpentry is an expensive classification code for a builder. For example, in South Carolina, one carrier's current rate for workers' comp for residential carpentry is $19.51 per $100 of payroll, and their rate for interior trim is $11.26 per $100 of payroll. The technical rules published by the National Council on Compensation Insurance, which most insurance carriers follow, say that all framing, siding, roofing, interior trim, wallboard, and floor installation, when performed by a general contractor at a work site, must come under the residential carpentry class code. Furthermore, the governing classification rule is responsible for dumping inside cleaning and yard debris removal into residential carpentry as well, in most cases. This has never made a whole lot of sense to me, but these are the rules and the carriers do have the power to enforce them. However, some carriers or self-insurance funds follow what I call the common sense rules and will allow a breakout of the less expensive class codes to be used, such as interior trim, wallboard, janitorial, and debris removal. You need to be aware of how your carrier handles this situation to properly deduct. Once you know the proper classification code, you apply the appropriate rate per $100 of labor paid to the uninsured sub. The proper rate for each classification code can be obtained in a variety of ways. You can find it on the rate page of your insurance policy, which is a page near the front of the policy that breaks out the rates for each classification code. These rates are based on per $100 of labor for work comp and per $1,000 of labor for general liability. I like to convert the general liability rates to $100 of labor. Or you can ask for your insurance agent to provide a withholding rate sheet that lists the rates for each class code for both workers' comp and general liability. It's important to note that the pure rates per $100 of labor may not reflect your true cost of doing business. The reason is because your policy may reflect additional credits and surcharges that are applied after the specific classification code rates. For example, if your work comp policy has an experience modification of 1.2, your actual cost will be 20% higher than the classification code rates. You might want to refer to our earlier video entitled Workers' Compensation Part 2 for a quick review of experience modifications. Some builders add an administrative hassle surcharge on top of the normal rates in order to offset administration expenses and to provide more incentive for the sub to get his own policy. And finally, any amounts that you deduct should not be commingled with your operations account. Instead, they should be placed in an escrow account and held to make sure that you have the funds available to pay your audit bill. This concludes our video on how to properly deduct from uninsured subs. I hope that you found it to be of value. Please call our office if you have any additional questions.